Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Jang-cho. The leaders of the United States and North Korea will soon meet again to flesh out details of the agreement from their first summit in Singapore. From concrete denuclearization steps to peace declaration to possible easing of economic sanctions, today we preview the likely outcome from the Hanoi summit.
I haven't taken sanctions off. I'd love to be able to, but in order to do that, we have to do something that's meaningful on the other side.
In the studio with me today, Mr. David Maxwell, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces Colonel with assignments in Korea. Also joining me today, Mr. Frank Senior Expert on North Korea at the United States Institute of Peace. Mr. served as the Senior Advisor for North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Now, looking at the outcome from the Hanoi summit on denuclearization, what is your low bar and high bar expectations?
Well, I think I would like to see a definition, agreed upon definition of denuclearization of North Korea, not denuclearization of the entire peninsula. And a most important outcome for me would be the continuation of working level talks that have really just begun. That is the most important. I think we could see at the high level, and they've already discussed Yongbyon and Sohae and Pyongyang. It would be great to have a commitment to dismantling Yongbyon and a commitment to inspection of the dismantling of Yongbyon. But I think that has always been, in past agreements, it's the inspection regime that has caused problems. So that's the high end. The real low end, I think, is, there would be really no agreement and nothing nothing that comes out of it. And of course, the worst case would be for President Trump or Kim to get up and walk out. Although I don't think that's likely. I think that in the last couple weeks between the special representatives, Began and Kim Hyok-chol, I think that they've probably worked out sufficient agreements to have a positive outcome.
I know there's a lot of skepticism in D.C. about the summit. I'm slightly more optimistic for a few reasons. One is I think the State Department and the White House is very aware of all the criticism that came out of the Singapore summit, how it was very symbolic but without tangible outcomes. I know that they'll want to avoid that type of criticism. Also, from Began's remarks at Stanford a few weeks ago, he basically articulated a strategy to North Korea that is very different from past strategies where it was, asking for denuclearization first and then being willing to talk about peace and normalization later. He described it as being willing to have simultaneous parallel talks about denuclearization and peace. So that's a very different approach than we've had in the past. So I agree much with what Dave said. I think in terms of a low bar, I think you need to have those sustained negotiations coming out of it. I think you need some sort of roadmap. It doesn't have to be precise, but there needs to be some broad picture of where we're going and how we're going to get there. And I think we need to see some tangible concessions from both sides. Some people will say that's a high bar, but I think at a minimum you need that just to say that we've advanced beyond Singapore. On the high end, I would love to see a freeze on fissile material production as well as ballistic missile production, and I would love to see an end of war declaration. But again, that has to come with the right concession from North Korea.
And just days before the summit, President Trump said a few things. He said, as long as there's no more testing, he said, I'm in no rush. This may not be the last time I meet with Chairman Kim. So how should we interpret this?
So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I think what he was trying to say is that what he said all along, or at least since Singapore, is that this is a process. We're not going to expect denuclearization all up front. This is going to take some time. I'm also speculating that he was trying to create a little leverage before Hanoi to say that he's not desperate for denuclearization. He's not going to give away the entire store just because he wants to achieve denuclearization all in one sitting. But I see how people can interpret what he said as very negative, that he is somehow accepting a nuclear North Korea as long as it doesn't conduct provocations. So I can understand the concern there.
Also, there was a background briefing by a senior U.S. official, and he said a few things also. And he said the priorities for the negotiations is the agreeing on the definition of denuclearization and working on a roadmap. And he also mentioned the freeze of all WMD. So why does he mention the freeze right before going into the summit? Does this mean the Trump administration is now moving more towards interim goal of a freeze of a nuclear facilities in North Korea?
Well, I think a freeze on their nuclear weapon production, their missile production, as well as their fissile material production, has always been a goal that the U.S. government has looking for. Obviously, you're not going to get complete denuclearization up front. So what would be a significant step that the U.S. can achieve before denuclearization? I think a freeze would be a good step.
And is the Trump administration moving more towards that idea of a freeze?
I think that's been a policy goal for the UN administration for the last 30 years, to get that freeze first before you go on to further steps.
I also wanted to ask you, the senior U.S. official also said that he wants this process to be quick and in big bites. What does this mean? Is this a pushback against those analyses that U.S. is softening its negotiation stance?
No, I think that's the actual strategy, and what that does is split the difference between the two extremes. There are many that call for step-by-step, one measure for one measure, which in the past that has really led to failure over time. There's always some place where it breaks down. And then there's the other extreme where there is the grand bargain, and there's the immediate denuclearization, which I think is also, not feasible and not ever likely to happen. So what I think this big bite strategy is to have substantial agreement on big parts of the process and do it perhaps in 1, 2, 3 in large bites rather than this small step-by-step process that is likely to fail, and the large grand bargain, which is not likely to be achieved. So I think this is a good strategy, and I don't think it's a pushback on anything. I think it's a sound strategy.
I want to look at other items on the agenda too. So the Liaison office was on the media that U.S. is considering this, and is this a good idea for both U.S. and North Korea?
I think it would be a great first step. We're not at the point of where we're considering normalization yet, but I think if we're trying to achieve new U.S.-DPRK relations, which is what the first outcome of the Singapore statement said, then I think establishing liaison offices in each of the capitals would be a great first step. I'm not sure how much North Korea is interested in this. From what I heard from reporting, they don't seem that interested in a liaison office, and that would actually be a good signal, because if they want new U.S.-DPRK relations and they're not happy about a liaison office as a concession from the U.S., then that's very telling. I don't think that signals that North Korea is very interested in improving relations with the U.S. then.
Yes, I think liaison offices are a good step forward. Again, we can't get to normalization until North Korea really changes, in particular, its human rights abuses as well. But I think there's no substitute for face-to-face talking and relationships. I think one of the things that we've seen in the last year that very few people seem to recognize, the positive, is that this is the longest period and the largest amount of high-level sustained talks between North Korea and the United States. Secretary of State, the CIA director, and then, of course, the president will now meet a second time with them. But at the highest level, the talks have been productive. Kim Jong-un has delayed working level talks, which is the real problem, although I think we've done a good job waiting him out and forcing his hand, and now that they have appointed a DPRK special representative to the United States as a counterpart to Mr. Biegun, I think that's Kim recognizing that they have to conduct substantive negotiations, and so working level talks and liaison could be a very positive step forward. But I fully agree with Frank. That will be an indicator on what Kim Jong-un's intentions are. And I think that if he doesn't do that, then he is fearful of the outcome or is not sincere in moving the process forward.
If any one of you can take this question, it is expected that the end of war declaration, there's going to be some progress on there too, but there are concerns that the focus of the talks is now moving from denuclearization to peace. Do you share the same concerns?
Yes. I think the end of war declaration, has to be done right. I think we forget that, North Korea attacked the South. North Korea was the aggressor. The United Nations resolutions recognized that, called on nations to support the freedom of the Republic of Korea. And of course, we did that, and now we have an armistice. So the belligerents are North and South Korea. The United States intervened under the authorities of the United Nations. So the United States did not declare war on North Korea. So I think an end of war declaration has to be between North and South Korea. And certainly a peace treaty has to be between the both. But we should not forget that North Korea is responsible for the deaths of 1.2 million people because they attacked the South. And so this end of war declaration really has to have a recognition of what the North did, and it has to really include South Korea. Otherwise, and this is my big concern, if North Korea is trying to cut out South Korea, this is really another indication of the North's continued strategy to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea, and that is problematic.
But I would say that, again, an end of war declaration is just a statement of what is already a fact, right? The war has been over for over 65 years. And so I agree that, it is an important symbolic statement, so we can't just make it without an appropriate concession from North Korea. But again, what we're looking at is just a statement of what is a fact, right? I think President Trump has given an emphasis on peace that is greater than previous presidents have provided. So I think that's a good step to show that we are not only trying to demand denuclearization from North Korea, but also willing to talk about peace simultaneously. And so if that's the case, then I think that's positive. I don't think we should be talking about peace prior to denuclearization, but I think talking about it in parallel is a good step.
Just let me add one point on this. We should not expect, if there is a declaration of the end of a war, we should not expect that that's going to somehow change North Korean behavior or that they're going to make some concession. I think if there is a declaration of the end of the war, Kim Jong-un simply checks that box and moves on to the next demand. So we should not expect that an end of war declaration is going to create some great condition that's going to lead to denuclearization. I think Frank is exactly right. It's a fact that with the end of the armistice in 1953, the end of fighting, we still say we're technically at war, but I do think that an end of war declaration has to be between North and South. We can be part of that, but in the end, it's not going to bring us any great benefit because it won't cause Kim Jong-un to do something to our liking.
Right, but I wouldn't count out the possibility that an end of war declaration could signify to the North Korean people that this war footing that we've had for so many years is over, and it's all a part of the process to let them know that the U.S. is not an adversary. Of course it is, but just to take one step to chip away at that psychological understanding of the U.S. as an adversary and North Korea being in this adversarial state, I think that can only be helpful for relations going forward.
I got to ask one last point though. A declaration brings no additional security to South Korea. North Korea's forces are still postured for offensive operations. They are a threat to South Korea, and the end of war declaration does not improve the security for the Republic of Korea, and that's something we also have to keep in mind.
I want to look at the sanctions. So South Korean President Moon offered to President Trump that he is willing to restart economic projects with North Korea, and this could be a concession that President Trump can use on the negotiating table. What is your take on that?
Well, I think President Trump has been very consistent about having our allies shoulder more of the burden for the costs of stationing U.S. troops in Korea, but also for their own defense, right? So the less the U.S. can pay and the more that all allies can pay, I think President Trump is very much in support of that. So if one of the concessions is incentives towards economic development, and it's not the U.S. that's paying, but South Korea through these economic development activities, then I think President Trump is very much in support of that.
Last question. David, so having this second summit with Kim Jong-un now, is this giving too much prestige to Chairman Kim?
Well, I think he certainly achieved that in Singapore. I think he certainly will use this for his domestic political purposes to enhance his legitimacy. I think he's putting himself on the same level as Xi and Putin, having met with Trump multiple times now. And so, I think that's a fact. But I don't think that bothers President Trump at all. And I think, yes, it seems like we're giving him too much notoriety on the world stage. But if it moves the process forward, that's not a bad thing. And I don't think it's something that President Trump really worries about.
Well, on that note, let's watch video for our next conversation.
인민 생활을 획기적으로 높이는 것은 우리 당과 국가의 제일 가는 중대사입니다.
These are the people that are pushing him toward the economy as being the focus of North Korea's future now.
Chairman Kim and North Korean state media this year repeatedly emphasized the need to boost the country's economy. Is this the influence of moneyed elite? Now, Frank, Chairman Kim Jong-un wants to develop the economy, and do you think this is the drive of the elites, his core supporters in North Korea?
I think Chairman Kim recognizes that the economy needs to develop. He recognizes the reality of markets in North Korea. There's hundreds of black and gray markets in North Korea. Marketization was helpful in the North Korean people coping with the famine from the mid to late 90s. So Kim Jong-un recognizes that in order for him to provide for the security of the regime, but also his people, that economic development is important. There may be some pressure from the elites, but again, that's hard to quantify. I'm sure at some sort of collective level there may be, but I think Kim Jong-un recognizes that himself.
I think Kim Jong-un's firmly in power. I think that he makes a decision, the elite is going to follow suit. I think their system is designed that way. I don't think there is the kind of pressure that we in the West might envision. I think that he's really locked solid and in step there. What I think, though, and I agree with Frank, the 400 markets, the legal markets that exist inside North Korea, what this is a recognition of is that the socialist workers' paradise, socialism requires capitalism to be fed. So the capitalists have to feed the socialists, and I think Kim Jong-un has recognized that, and that's why he has allowed this marketization to occur, and why he would welcome investment by South Korea into North Korea's economy.
You mentioned about the markets, but what about also the 돈주s, the moneyed, wealthy businessmen? Do they have any influence over Kim Jong-un's thinking?
Well, I think he sees what's happening. I think that he has to have a balance between the moneyed classes as well as the markets getting too far out of control. It is still a centrally controlled economy, and if they expand and do become and make too many demands on the party, that could, of course, cause destabilization. So I think we'll see a crackdown before that happens. So I think he sees them making money. I think they we've seen crackdowns for corruption, and I think that's where he sees, threats to stability, where that will occur. But I think his movement towards market economy and economic development is clearly an understanding on his part that socialism doesn't work in North Korea, and that he has to have capitalism and capitalist help to survive.
And high-level defection also continues. Ambassador to Italy, Cho Seong-gil, defected recently. Why do you think the diplomats defect?
There could be any number of reasons. It could be sort of disillusionment with the North Korean regime. It could be their consideration for the future of their children. Tae Young-ho talked about that with his own two boys. It could be just maybe that they had some issue. Maybe they didn't generate enough money, and they feel that they're going to be persecuted. So it could be any number of reasons.
Yeah, the important point from Tae Young-ho, I think that he really said that he could no longer explain the contradiction that is in North Korea and explain what North Korea, the regime does, what it is, and explain that in terms of the rest of the world. And that really led to his decision to defect. And I think the consideration of his two boys, really fed into that.
And North Korea Strategy Center, a South Korean NGO, said that there was a massive purge recently. Does this show that Kim Jong-un has total control over these people, the elites?
Yes, although I think that report is a little bit mischaracterized. They have assessed the purges and executions that have taken place since Kim came to power. And so I think some of the media reports touted that as, recent purges and executions. I do think Kim is in power. I do think that the Kim family regime, the Juche ideology, Kim Il-sungsism is designed to keep him in power. And those structures remain in place. And so I don't see the ability for the elite or for the wavering classes, for the military yet to do something that would oppose Kim Jong-un, because he continues to rule by terror and with an iron hand.
In negotiations with North Korea, the United States asks Chairman Kim to make that strategic decision for his country. So how do you think the elites play into this making strategic decision?
I think there may be some consideration of what the interests are of the elites. But again, the interests of the elites and of the regime are fairly aligned. They both want to maintain their power, their position in society. And so I think they're looking towards somewhat of a status quo. And so we need to be able to convince the elites that denuclearization and peace ultimately is in their interest. We can do that. For example, we talked about, amnesty given to scientists, but other ways to let them know that their world doesn't crumble once we develop better relations with North Korea.
You want to add?
Yes, I think, just really to reiterate, I think, Frank is exactly right. The alignment of interests of the elite and Kim Jong-un are really, really the same. I think that the elite will see opportunities, and so I think, to benefit, but they want to survive. They don't want to lose power and prestige and the resources that they have access to. So as long as that continues, I think that they'll be satisfied.
We'll end our conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of a barber in Vietnam offering a free haircuts to people who wish to copy President Trump's or Chairman Kim's distinctive hairstyles. The owner of the barbershop says he initially offered the promotion for fun, but was surprised at the enthusiastic response and that Chairman Kim's style is more popular among customers. Frank, what's your reaction?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un's hairstyle is a lot more common among younger folks, the tight fade on the side, and then having older folks like me who are losing hair probably have the wig like Trump. So I can see how that might be popular with older folks.
It may show the alignment of two communist countries, Vietnam and North Korea, and so that may be. We may see that same kind of mindset in both countries and want to copy the leader of a like country.
Well, on that note, Mr. Maxwell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.